A collapse that unfolded not over weeks or months but in hours. Hours that rewrote the battlefield calculus of this war. Hours that sent shockwaves through the halls of the Kremlin. Hours that may have fundamentally altered the trajectory of this conflict. What Russia's military command did over the past 72 hours crossed a line that President Putin had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, coordination, and overwhelming tactical superiority. President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a late-night address that has now been viewed tens of millions of times, declared what many thought impossible just months ago: victory on a scale that has left military analysts around the world scrambling to understand what exactly happened and what comes next. For weeks now there had been signals, not official briefings, not Pentagon press releases, just signals that Russia was preparing something unusual. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a doctrine. They telegraph strength, they mass forces, they announce objectives, they grind forward. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian troop movements know the indicators: the repositioning of command units, the stockpiling of ammunition at forward positions, the rotation of fresh conscripts to frontline sectors, the sudden consolidation of air defense systems. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. But this time the silence meant something different entirely. This time the silence wasn't preparation. It was confusion. It was a military command structure that had lost cohesion. It was generals who no longer trusted the orders coming from Moscow. And it was frontline troops who had simply had enough. Early Thursday morning, NATO surveillance assets detected what they described as unprecedented defensive degradation, including withdrawal patterns that had not been observed in over 18 months of sustained conflict. These are the kinds of movements that Russian forces only execute when they are signaling something very specific: strategic retreat, command failure, or catastrophic loss of morale. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing posture, and when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by small measures, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. What emerged over the following hours painted a picture that even the most optimistic Ukrainian commanders had not anticipated. Russian troops were not simply withdrawing, they were abandoning. Heavy equipment was being left behind. Fortified positions that had been reinforced over months were being vacated overnight, and in some sectors Ukrainian reconnaissance units reported something they had never seen before: Russian soldiers walking toward Ukrainian lines with their hands raised, asking to surrender. Not in ones or twos, in dozens. The assessment issued by Pentagon officials tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Source after source, briefing after briefing, described Russia's collapse as unprecedented, accelerating, and perhaps most importantly systemic, indicating that this was not a localized failure but a fundamental breakdown in Russian military cohesion. But strategic collapse only matters if the opposing force can capitalize on it. Ukraine did not hesitate. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive and coordinated offensive operations we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know: within 6 hours of detecting Russian withdrawal patterns, Ukrainian forces launched simultaneous operations across 4 separate axes of advance. These weren't the probing attacks we've seen in previous months. These were full-scale armored thrust combined arms operations that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to exploit a breakthrough. Western-supplied Leopard 2 tanks led the advance, Bradley fighting vehicles provided infantry support, and overhead Ukrainian drones, thousands of them, provided real-time intelligence that allowed commanders to adjust in ways Russia simply could not match. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian positions across the southern and eastern fronts, including a major logistics hub that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned winter offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute. They hit command posts. They hit ammunition depots, They hit armored columns that were likely preparing to reinforce collapsing defensive lines. In other words, Ukraine targeted the spine of Russia's southern military presence, the coordination that would have allowed organized resistance. This is what made intelligence assessments so urgent. Russia's defensive posture wasn't just degrading, it was disintegrating. It represented the kind of breakdown that could cascade across the entire front if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't overextend into prepared kill zones, they didn't waste resources on symbolic targets. They hit logistics networks, they hit command infrastructure, they hit the systems that allow a modern military to function, and in doing so they turned a Russian retreat into a Russian rout. According to reports emerging from multiple sources, Ukrainian forces advanced more ground in 48 hours than they had in the previous 4 months combined. Villages that had been occupied since the early months of the war saw Ukrainian flags raised for the first time in nearly 2 years, and in one particularly significant development, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces reportedly captured a Russian general-grade officer who had been attempting to flee in a civilian vehicle. That officer is now in Ukrainian custody, and the intelligence he carries may prove invaluable in the days ahead. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest defensive posture was designed to test the resilience of Ukrainian offensive capabilities after months of attritional warfare. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would exhaust itself against fortified positions, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't exhaust itself, they found the weak points that Russia didn't know it had. They exploited gaps in command and control that were so precise, so surgical that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but today Ukraine did. Military analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's defensive collapse as systemic fragmentation, a way to describe what happens when an army loses faith in its own leadership. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and adaptive. Their operations were not only well planned, they were executed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to establish secondary defensive lines. That timing matters because it shows something crucial about Ukrainian military intelligence. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian movements, they are anticipating them, they are inside Russia's decision-making cycle, and that gives them an advantage that no amount of manpower can overcome. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's offensive. Ukrainian armored brigades carried out breakthrough operations on 4 separate fronts, forcing Russian units to choose between fighting or fleeing. Most chose to flee. Ukrainian air assets targeted supply convoys that had been positioned for what Moscow believed would be a prolonged defensive operation in the coming months. Ukrainian special forces operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed communication nodes used by Russian command to coordinate defensive operations across the entire southern sector. This wasn't just a tactical victory, this wasn't just a successful operation. This was strategic breakthrough, this was operational initiative. And operational initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed assault on Kiev in the war's opening weeks. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that nullifies the gain. For every kilometer Russia has taken, they have paid a price in blood and equipment that their military simply cannot sustain. And tonight that bill came due. Remember, Russia thought this war would last days. They thought Kyiv would fall before the world could respond. They thought Ukraine would collapse under the weight of their military superiority. They thought NATO would fragment under economic pressure. They thought the West would lose interest. They thought time was on their side. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is advancing. Russia is retreating. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. And the Kremlin is facing questions it has no good answers for. How do you explain to the Russian people that the army you claimed was invincible is now abandoning positions without a fight? How do you explain that the military operation you promised would be over in weeks has now consumed hundreds of thousands of soldiers? How do you explain that the enemy you dismissed as weak is now dictating the terms of this conflict? These are questions Vladimir Putin will have to answer, and based on what we've seen tonight, he may not have good answers. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest collapse happened at a time when Putin is under unprecedented internal pressure. Military hardliners want escalation, economic pragmatists want negotiation, regional governors want resources redirected to domestic needs, and ordinary Russians want the war to end. Putin is balancing these demands while watching his military suffer its most significant defeat since the war began. And when leaders in that position face sudden reversals, they're not operating from strength, they're operating from pressure, they're operating from vulnerability, and vulnerable leaders with nuclear arsenals are the most dangerous actors in international politics. This is why Western officials are watching Moscow so carefully tonight, not just for what the Russian military does next, but for what the Kremlin does in response to humiliation. The White House statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow this moment to spiral into uncontrolled escalation. Officials said plainly that Russia's military collapse was inconsistent with the Kremlin's stated objectives and raises serious questions about the sustainability of their campaign. That is diplomatic language for Russia is losing and everyone knows it. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. And something serious is at stake, because what happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether this victory becomes a turning point or a trigger for something far more dangerous. NATO Secretary General addressed reporters just hours ago, emphasizing that the alliance remains committed to Ukraine's defense while calling for responsible de-escalation from all parties. That language is carefully chosen. It acknowledges Ukraine's success while leaving room for Russia to find an off-ramp. Whether Moscow takes that off-ramp remains to be seen. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people and the world in a powerful emotional speech tonight. He said, "Today our soldiers proved what we have always known, that courage and conviction will always triumph over tyranny and aggression." He said to the mothers and fathers who have sacrificed sons and daughters for this cause, "I say this, their courage was not in vain. Their sacrifice built the foundation upon which we now stand victorious." And he said to those who believed we would fall, who believed Ukraine would submit, who believed freedom could be extinguished by force, "Today is your answer." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that military victory means nothing if it cannot be consolidated. He knows that Russia will not accept defeat quietly, and he knows that the eyes of the world are watching to see what Ukraine does with this moment. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's defensive collapse wasn't isolated. Along with the military retreat, Russian cyber units also launched intensified attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, suggesting desperation to disrupt Ukrainian command and control. Russian state media dramatically shifted messaging, pivoting from claims of imminent victory to warnings about Western escalation, and Russian diplomatic channels increased activity targeting neutral nations, attempting to reframe the narrative before the scale of defeat becomes undeniable. All of this happened within the same 24-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means the Kremlin is scrambling to control a narrative that has slipped beyond their grasp. And it means the next phase of this conflict may look very different from what came before. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a strategic consolidation, abandoning indefensible positions to establish stronger lines elsewhere. Another is that Russia is attempting to buy time for mobilization of additional forces, hoping to stabilize the front before Ukraine can exploit further. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is preparing to escalate in ways that go beyond conventional warfare. But today Ukraine took that calculation off the table. They didn't wait for Russia to regroup, they didn't pause to allow diplomatic intervention, they didn't give Moscow breathing room. They pressed their advantage with everything they had, and in doing so they sent a message that resonates far beyond this battlefield. Ukraine will not stop until victory is complete. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine will overextend. Ukraine wants to show that their offensive capabilities remain intact. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling beyond Ukraine's borders. and China is watching to see what lessons can be drawn for their own strategic calculations. Every actor on the global stage understands that what happens here will shape the international order for decades to come. If Russia can be defeated in Ukraine, the era of territorial conquest through military force may truly be over. If Russia somehow recovers and prevails, authoritarian powers worldwide will draw very different conclusions. The stakes could not be higher. Tonight we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command communications in real time. They say confusion within Russian military leadership has reached levels not seen since the early days of the invasion. They say multiple Russian units have gone silent, suggesting either communication failures or deliberate attempts to avoid orders to counterattack. And they say Russia's decision to withdraw from fortified positions is likely part of a broader recognition that the current strategy has failed completely. But Ukraine is not resting on today's success. In fact, Ukraine is already positioning forces for the next phase of operations. Their response today, swift, devastating, and comprehensive, sent a message to Moscow that this war has fundamentally changed. And it sent a message to the West that continued support is producing results that no one thought possible just months ago. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their defensive strategy. But what we do know is that Ukraine's offensive was timely. It capitalized on a moment of Russian weakness. It demonstrated capabilities that exceeded expectations, and it fundamentally altered the psychological balance of this conflict. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next 72 hours. If they accept the reality of their position and seek genuine negotiation, this moment will be remembered as the turning point that ended the war. If they escalate, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to defend. They have shown they are ready to win. And tonight, for the first time since this war began, Russia appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet, and when the Kremlin is quiet, it means they are calculating, it means they are assessing options none of them wanted to consider. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before but refused to accept, that military force cannot crush a nation's will to survive, that the world will not look away from aggression, and that Ukraine, this nation of 40 million people who refuse to surrender, has become the force that may finally break the myth of Russian military invincibility. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear: Ukraine has seized the initiative. Russia's defensive strategy has collapsed, and the world is watching as history unfolds in ways no one predicted. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this extraordinary conflict unfolds.